Good evening. I'm Johanna Evans, Vice President of the White River Indie Films, and I am so excited to be introducing tonight's panel. This topic is really important to me, and I've been spending hours a week volunteering alongside people in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Pennsylvania, trying to get out the vote and trying to educate voters about how to vote by mail and the importance of expressing their voice in this upcoming election. These films that we've chosen tonight, I think, speak especially strongly towards this issue, and so I'm so thrilled that all of you are joining us tonight for this discussion. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Samantha to come on board to introduce the rest of the event. Hello, Samantha.
Hi, I'm Samantha Davidson Green, and I am serving presently as the president of WRIF. We're a nonprofit volunteer-run media arts community based in White River Junction, Vermont, committed to catalyzing change through film and filmmaking. Tonight is the second panel. Our first 2 weeks ago focused on the candidate side of race in US elections. Tonight we will focus on the voter side. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation, Michael Herron, Professor of Government at Dartmouth College, and I'm grateful to say my good friend. Professor Herron's current research is on a topic of great interest to us all, absentee voting. Professor Herron found his interest in election administration and voting irregularities in 2000, when, as a postdoc at Harvard, he and his colleagues in political science started noticing weird features in the voting data coming out of Palm Beach, Florida, an election many of us remember. The analysis resulted in one of the early papers on the causes and consequences of the flawed butterfly ballot, establishing the centrality of data to any serious understanding of forces at work in or against our democracy. As tonight's films concur, the data tell the story, and those who understand it can alter the outcome. Before I turn it over to Michael to introduce our panelists, WRIF wishes to thank our generous sponsors who made this series possible: the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, the Leslie Center for the Humanities at Dartmouth College, and the Ben & Jerry's Foundation, our media sponsor, Vermont Public Radio, and our community partners, Rights and Democracy Vermont, Vermont International Film Festival, and CATV. We've scheduled our conversation to last 75 minutes, or until approximately 8:45, with the possibility of extending to 9 p.m. if the conversation is really getting going. We encourage you to put your questions or comments in the chat, whether you're coming to us on YouTube or Facebook. They will all feed to us, and we will respond to those at some time after a moderated discussion. Please go to rif.org for further action paths. There's a big button that says action, and you can find a lot more information there, as well as further links related to the films. Thank you to our panelists and audience for being here and for your concern for this important subject, and welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Samantha and Johanna, and I'm honored to be the moderator of this really neat panel. It's been really a great educational experience for me learning about our panelists and what they're doing. So I'm going to briefly introduce everyone, and then we'll begin talking. I'll start with the most, as I'm going to start our conversation with sort of general to specific. Our first panelist I'll introduce is Rebecca Green. Rebecca is professor of practice at William and Mary Law School in Virginia. She works on election law, which is obviously the reason she's here right now. Her work touches on redistricting, geographic information systems, and she's also involved with alternate dispute resolution. Rebecca Green has degrees from Connecticut College, and her law degree is from Harvard. And great, thank you, Rebecca. I'm looking forward to speaking with you. Next, I'll talk about David Daley. David is written 2 books. The second is called, or first or second, is called Unrigged: How Americans are Battling Back to Save Democracy. The other book, Johanna, if you could just cue up the title for the meeting. Thank you. I'll let you do the reading. So this is another book that David Daley has authored. I'm sure, David, I'm not the first one to stumble over exactly how to say the title. These books are all about sort of the contemporary voting experience in the United States. David is a journalist. His work has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, Washington Post, and he was former editor of Salon. You recognize David because he was featured in Slay the Dragon. Thank you, David. Look forward to speaking with you as well. Now I'd like to introduce Othniel Harris. So I'm sort of now narrowing down to North Carolina, or voter experiences in particular. Othniel is the Regional Voter Protection Director, working with the North Carolina Democratic Party. He's involved with recruitment, training, and management of out-of-state volunteers, and in particular, the Voter Assistance Hotline. I had the pleasure of watching a YouTube speech that Othniel gave in spring 2019 to American University. Othniel was really neat. I would encourage anyone who, after this talk, is interested, you can Google Othniel's presentation and listen to it. So that was an impressive thing. Othniel, look forward to speaking with you today as well. And now I'd like to turn to Laverne Berry. You recognize Laverne from Capturing the Flag. Laverne is a lawyer. She's been a lawyer for 18 years. She works primarily in entertainment and the media business. Her work has been involved with New York Public Television, RKO General Television, Avon Books. In addition, Laverne has the sort of awards that makes talking about her very fun. So I'll mention that she has 2 Golden Eagles, 2 Emmy nominations, 2 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So congratulations on all those. Laverne, look forward to meeting you in person, having watched you in the movie. Lastly, Capturing the Flag was produced and directed by Anne De Mare. So Anne De Mare is our last panelist. She's also, she has an Emmy Award-winning documentary, which is wonderful. And she's her first film, which I've started watching and now will continue, is called Asparagus, Stalking the American Life, which is about rural farmers in Western Michigan and the global economy. Looks like a fantastic movie. She has a project now working on, it's called The Real Rosie Riveter Project, which is involved in understanding women's roles in munitions factories in the Second World War. She also has founded a foundation called, her movies are produced by Spargo Productions, which I must say is sort of a fun word because Spargo means asparagus in German. So I noticed that your movie is the word asparagus, and so does your production company. And maybe at some point you can tell us like how that might fit and help us understand your work. But that was clever. So look forward to speaking with you too.
Thank you.
So with all that, it's a neat panel. People have many different perspectives, and that's an exciting opportunity for all of us. So I'm going to start out with some questions, and then just to follow up what Samantha said, please don't hesitate to contribute questions to the group in the chat, maybe 30, 35, 40 minutes or so. But obviously sending them early is fine too. We'll pay attention to what the audience is interested in, and we want to engage you in this conversation. So I'd like to start by thinking about these 2 films in the following way. One film, Slay the Dragon, I would sort of say is about the rules and the environment of American elections. And obviously gerrymandering is part of this. That's a part of districting. And I would see that movie as exploring how the rules have changed and how and what the rules are. And then the second film, second not in any sort of serious sense, but in the sense I'm describing it, really is about voters and how they act in an environment created by the rules. Rules are in procedures. So I'm going to start by asking about sort of the broader environment for elections. And I want to turn to the issue of the Voting Rights Act. This actually came up in Capturing the Flag as well. The Voting Rights Act is a very important bill, and I'm going to turn to Rebecca. Rebecca, if you could talk a little bit about this bill in Shelby County and sort of explain, your sense of how this bill and Shelby County, which is an important Supreme Court case, really have set the stage for us to think about elections at the moment.
Sure. So I'm happy to set the stage. So in the 1960s, after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that killed 4 little girls in the Selma March, the public was clamoring for a law that would fix horrific voting discrimination in the South. And the problem, before that point had been that as soon as plaintiffs were able to overturn a discriminatory law, Southern legislatures would immediately find new ways to prevent Black access to the vote. So President Johnson asked his Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, to write him the goddamnest, toughest law he could write. And the genius of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the law that emanated from that command, was that it stopped legislatures from putting discriminatory voting laws on the books in the first place. It did this by requiring that certain states and jurisdictions with histories of discrimination in voting, they had to get permission from the federal government before they could make any change in their voting law and before any voting law could go into effect. That process was called pre-clearance, and it was extraordinary to require states to get permission to pass laws. That's not how our system generally works. States that had to seek pre-clearance were referred to as covered jurisdictions, and a state became a covered jurisdiction according to a formula that was set forth in a different section of the Voting Rights Act. So under that formula, a jurisdiction was covered if on November 1st, 1964, it had maintained a test or device like a literacy test that restricted the opportunity of people to register, or if it had low registration or voting rates as of November 1st, 1964. And so using that formula, states like Alabama, Alaska, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia were required to pre-clear any change to their voting laws. That provision went further than any before it in stopping discrimination in voting. Black registration and voting shot up in covered jurisdictions immediately following the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 5 stopped who knows how many restrictive voting laws that would otherwise have seen the light of day. This formula remained in place using these triggers until 2013. It kept getting reauthorized by Congress every time it was about to sunset. And in 2013, the Supreme Court struck the coverage formula in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, essentially holding that the coverage formula was unconstitutional. The majority opinion in that case was written by Chief Justice Roberts, and his main beef was that Congress hadn't updated the coverage formula, and it was still keyed to the 1964 numbers. The majority opinion said that this outdated formula meant that some states still had to get permission from the federal government to pass voting laws, but other states could pass those same laws without getting permission, and that was fundamentally unfair and violated what he called the equality principle, So Justice Ginsburg wrote a very fiery dissent in that case where she called out the majority for its decision. She argued that what the majority had done is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. It had been working so well that throwing it away would really, essentially get us wet. And indeed, after Shelby County came down, like I'm talking that day, legislatures in states like Texas and North Carolina passed voting laws they knew would have been denied pre-clearance had the Voting Rights Act Section 5 still been in place. So it's important to know that the Voting Rights Act lives on. Section 2 is still in force around the country, which is a different provision that protects a different set of rights. But unfortunately, this pre-clearance process that prevented a lot of what would be discriminatory laws from coming into place was struck down in 2013. And I think the movies that we saw for tonight, really kind of highlighted that shift.
Great. So, David, how would you say you saw that shift thinking about the gerrymandering issues that were covered in Slay the Dragon?
The Shelby County case turbocharged so much of the voter suppression that was underway, but the voter suppression was already underway. And the gerrymandering that began this cycle, it started, as you saw in the movie and as I wrote about in the book, really, it has its outgrowth with the election of 2008. Barack Obama is elected president, our first Black president. Democrats win a supermajority in the U.S. Senate that night. They hold on to the U.S. House. And if you go back and look at that night, you had some of the brightest minds in American politics on all sides of the aisle talking about how the Republican Party was going to be the minority party in this country for a generation to come, that the demographics of the nation were shifting in such a way that the Democratic coalition was going to be ascendant for some time to come, and didn't exactly turn out that way, did it? That is largely because you had a handful of Republican operatives who understood that, as historic as 2008 might have been, 2010 had the ability to be all the more consequential. It was a 0 year, a year ending in 0, which means the census happens, which means redistricting happens the year after that. And these Republican strategists looked around the country and they said, okay, here's our path back to power. We could take control of state legislatures in places like North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Florida. All these states sound familiar, right? We're still talking about these states as being sort of the tipping states. And if we could win 107 state legislative seats across these 16 states, they would have the ability to draw 190 of the 435 U.S. House seats, and also the ability, of course, to enforce conservative policies in all of these swing state legislatures and really lock in enduring control. And that is what, indeed, they did. For $30 million, they launched this plan. It's called REDMAP. It's the Redistricting Majority Project, and it was aptly titled. It created exactly what these operatives set out to create. Even in years in which Democratic voters, even in years in which Democratic candidates win more votes in all of these states, you have not seen control of any of the state legislative chambers in any of those states change, and the congressional delegations really haven't budged either. You now have something just over 50 million Americans who live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election. This is the nation that REDMAP created. The first thing that all of these state legislatures did is they went after voting rights. So you begin to see, right after the 2010 election, a dramatic increase in the number of states requiring really specific voter ID requirements. You begin to see states in which they are eroding numbers of days of early voting. And as you get to 2013, as you get to the Shelby decision, all of this turbocharges just as soon as those pre-clearance restrictions are removed. And you get these gerrymandered legislatures, which have already put themselves essentially insulated from the will of the voters on maps that are no longer responsive to changes in the public will. You begin to see a huge explosion, not only in voter ID bills, not only in the numbers of days of early voting being slashed, but you see precincts being closed across the South. You see 32 million voters purged from the rolls between the years of 2014 and 2018, predominantly Black voters, predominantly young voters, and predominantly in these states that had previously been covered under preclearance. This is not by happenstance. This is the product of a political strategy. I would say it's a political strategy by a party that has lost faith in the very idea of democracy and majority rule, that looked at the realities of a changing nation and decided it would be easier to build barriers to the ballot box in front of those people who they did not believe would vote for them, rather than talk to them and persuade them. This goes back decades. You can trace a very young man that shows up in Washington in 1982. He goes to work in the Civil Rights Department of Ronald Reagan's Justice Department. He has a problem with Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. He goes and tries to convince his superiors to oppose this reauthorization. He writes op-eds under their names. That man is John Roberts. He is now the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. This is a 40-year exercise in trying to defang the Voting Rights Act, as Rebecca just talked about, at Section 5. The court agreed this week to hear a case from Arizona that takes aim at Section 2. Buckle up, everybody.
Thanks. I'm wondering, I think this is for Laverne or maybe Othniel, because you've been in the trenches in North Carolina. Would you say that the voters with whom you worked, are they aware of this sort of issue about the Voting Rights Act? I mean, this is, Shelby County is one of these decisions that is sort of sitting in the background, and its influence is remarkable. Just to follow up one thing that what the panelists mentioned, literally all the changes that David was describing would have, the covered jurisdictions would have to get permission first. And so that's what was gutted. And I mean, it was a huge change. So Laverne, would you say, I mean, when you work with voters in North Carolina, Othniel, are they aware of this sort of, pre-Shelby, post-Shelby distinction?
I think it depends on who the voters are. But many voters believe that they have the right to vote and they show up at the poll. And so they know from their own experience or anecdotal evidence that that particularly minority voters have problems actually exercising their right to vote, but they don't think of it in terms of a long 40-year game plan. They think of it more as this has been happening forever, and there are different ways. First it was a poll tax, then it was an ID, then it was a this, then it was a that. So it's not, they don't think of it in those terms. They just know that if they're going to be able to vote, they're going to have to fight. And so the question is, what is the fight now?
Othniel, is that your experience as well?
I totally agree with Laverne in the fact that I think in speaking with voters in North Carolina, I think they see voter suppression as sort of repackaging and rebranding itself over time. I agree with Laverne that, there used to be a poll tax, and now today we see something like a witness requirement or photo ID. There used to be the 3/5 compromise, but now all of a sudden we see gerrymandering, where in North Carolina, the campus of North Carolina A&T State University was actually split in half, diminishing the voting power of young Black people who are in college. And I think that it's a time, especially now with the whole absentee balloting, the witness requirement that was in North Carolina, it used to be you needed 2 witnesses and a notary in order to send in an absentee ballot. So putting hurdles and requiring hurdles and for especially Black people to jump and get through to vote. And we got the witness requirement now down to just 1 witness and you can send your absentee ballot in. But as you can see in North Carolina, there's recent studies that still show that absentee ballots from Black voters are still being rejected at a rate higher than whites.
I'm wondering, as I'm hearing these comments, so everything post Shelby is sort of part of the long story. I'm sort of wondering, is it our obligation to make sure that people know the whole deal? So Anne, you're a filmmaker. I think you sort of see yourself as a storyteller. When you sort of think about a contemporary voting rights issue, and all the historical echoes. I mean, going back to the founding, as Othniel mentioned, the 3/5 compromise. Mm-hmm. When you think about like educating the public in your films, I want to teach them what's going on now. I want to give them the perspective. I mean, I'm sort of encouraging us to think broadly, but on the other hand, if you're trying to vote today, what you really care about is what's in front of you at the moment, and whether there was a Supreme Court argument may not be a big issue. So you might not be cognizant of it. So, what is your thought on that, Anne?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two answers to that question that have an equal importance to me. One is that I don't necessarily see my job as a storyteller to teach people, but I want to help people understand what their role in the larger story is. And I think that right now, if you look at, there's the legal sort of train wreck that we're in with voting rights right now, but there's also this assault on public trust and this assault on how valuable your vote really is. I mean, it's very obvious with the Trump administration and some of the things that he's doing in terms of, you know, questioning whether or not the election is going to be fair before it's happened, making people feel as if, you know, encouraging people to basically break the law by voting twice to see if the system works. Like, all of these horrible things are happening, and it erodes people's feeling of their own place in the democracy. So I think my feeling as a filmmaker is I want to look at who's telling the story of where we are as citizens in democracy. And it's interesting because in the little pre-conversation, we were talking about, you know, if things had gone differently, if Hillary Clinton had won the last election, would these films exist and have the same kind of power that they do now? And I think that there's a really interesting point there, which is that, you know, you have to speak truth to power, but you also have to understand where your power lies. And I feel like the best thing that we can do as storytellers is try to boil things back to their essential meaning. And when we set out to make Capturing the Flag, I really wanted the conversation in 2016 was so horrible. It was just such a negative time. It's hard to imagine that we can look back and say, oh, that was a horrible time. But everything about politics was being talked about top down, and no one was talking about what is the experience of being a voter? What is the experience of being a citizen? How can we empower ourselves to be better citizens and to participate more? So for me, our film is as much about citizen action and what everyday people can do to help make the system better as it is about the voter suppression from the legal standpoint. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. This was also occurring to me listening to you that there are these questions about broader institutions, that obviously that came up in Slay the Dragon as well. And now we're seeing, and as you just discussed, all this, comments about rigged elections and fraud. And I've written papers on fraud, and there's no evidence for systematic fraud in American elections. And I'm just wondering if how do you see in your voter protection work, for example, Othniel, again, this may be, I don't know if the people with whom you work are sort of thinking about this broader question, but do you see evidence of like trust in institutions? One thing that we saw in Slay the Dragon was that people realized that if they're in a packed or a cracked district, your vote is much less likely to be pivotal, have an effect on an outcome. And so now you can imagine the same sort of dynamic where people making charges about the entire efficacy of the electoral system. I'm curious, when you're recruiting volunteers, do you see people responding to that in a negative way, in a positive way?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience managing the voter assistance hotline, I mean, people call in and they have it's sort of like a hesitancy to believe the information we're giving them about the process. And they kind of have a way of like, all right, I'm going to take your word for it, but, I'm still going to do the research on my own type of thing. There is some type of mistrust in the electoral process right now, and I think that's because of a long-term misinformation campaign, not only by the current president of the United States, but by the Republican Party over a number of years. The types of information, even just this year, when we talk about mail-in balloting, there has been a campaign since the summer to misinform voters about the legitimacy of absentee voting.
So what do you, when someone calls you or your volunteers and you explain and they say, I don't believe you, like, what do you say?
Wow. You know what? There are times where I do tell people that, hey, if you don't believe me, sometimes I even like to show them a certain article. A certain article by like the Brookings Institution, or go to certain research that's been done, or even saying look up certain court cases where I believe there was a court case between a federal district court and Greg Abbott from Texas. He's probably going to be in the courts again, Governor Greg Abbott from Texas, where they were basically talking about voter fraud, and the judge was like, all right, prove to me how many cases of voter fraud have you had? And they kept saying, there's massive voter fraud in Texas, massive. And then the judge was still like, hand over the data, hand over the evidence of voter fraud. And they could only bring up only two cases in the history of Texas elections for, I think, about 10 years that proved that there was only 2 cases of voter fraud over 1,000 votes over those years. So I think sort of us having the good consciousness of our heart of sending out the correct information, that's all we can do sometimes. And we can try to reinforce it by saying, you can look up these things or you can visit these things. But at the end of the day, it's hoping that, they take our word for it. And, people who are volunteers on the phone, they literally tell them, like, I'm a volunteer, I wouldn't lie to you about these things.
All right, thank you. David, you were nodding, and I'm thinking about your Unrigged book now. I mean, how do you help people, to use your term, unrig some particular feature of an electoral environment when there's like disagreement about, or there's this fundamental mistrust, disagreement about what the facts are?
I might not be as worried about that as some others, because I think that this is a political project. I don't think it's a project of the American people. I think that, and all you've got to do is look at what happened on redistricting in 2018 to see this in 5 states, and these aren't 5 blue states. 5 states passed redistricting reform at the ballot box, and they were Utah, Colorado, Missouri, Ohio, and Michigan. So you're looking at purple states, red states, with the exception of Utah, where it was exceptionally close. It was above 60%, even into the 70s in some of those states. The American people are behind this. We don't like cheating. We don't like politicians having the ability to draw their own lines and choose their own voters and entrench themselves in office. You saw this in Florida as well, where in 2018, you had the success of Amendment 4, which returned voting rights to 1.4 million people in Florida, returning citizens who had a felony conviction in their past. And they were given their voting rights back. And that won with 64% of the vote in Florida before a gerrymandered legislature and a packed judiciary had their way and essentially added a modern day poll tax on top of it. But the people of Florida, even in 2018, when they elected a Republican governor in Ron DeSantis and a Republican senator in Rick Scott, almost 2/3 back Amendment 4 because it's the right thing to do. So I think when you look at the people are on the right side here.
So Laverne, I'm thinking about some scenes in the movie in Capturing the Flag where you're explaining to voters what they need to do, or your colleagues are doing the same thing. Did they always believe you? I mean, when you would say, okay, someone comes and says, I was sent from this precinct over that, I can't remember the individual woman's name, but there was a scene in Capturing the Flag where this happened, and you or one of your colleagues said, no, do this. I mean, do people always say, oh, yes, I'll do it? Or do they question you? I mean, just thinking about this whole issue of trust, what has been your experience?
I would say most of the time they trust us. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is, yes, before we get out on the streets, we study, and in 2016, it was 66 pages of law. So 66 pages of election law to be able to have someone be able to exercise their right to vote. So yes, we can point to specific things and say very specific things. But more than anything else, I think that people really want a witness to what's going on with them and how they are working to be able to exercise that. So if you tell someone that, yes, we will try and figure out where you are, and yes, you can call me back, and yes, I will help you, they will believe that you're there to help you, to help them. And And that is a real trust in the system, because people want to be able to believe that their vote is going to count. And the more that you can do to reinforce that belief, the better. So I get very good experience and very high turnout in terms of people believing what we have to say at the poll.
Okay, good. I want to follow up on that in one way here. And another sort of institutional question, which is related to districting, which is this whole, it was the Electoral College, which is another form of translating votes into outcomes. And I think it's a set of institutions that can also lead people to wonder, sort of what Laverne was getting at, like, what does it mean to count? That could mean, okay, my vote is tabulated, but the point of Slay the Dragon is your vote might be tabulated, but if it's in a district that is a very funny shape, it counts, but only in a different sense. So there's been discussion now, and I think it's because of the virus and just because of the political environment about the Electoral College, and this whole notion of people vote for electors in a state, and then the electors actually elect a president, and then we have this issue as in 2016, as I suspect most of the audience knows, that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the presidency. One thing that's come up is like electors and whom do they represent and what do they have to do. Rebecca, if you could give us a quick overview about this. So Rebecca sent me one of her papers about faithless electors. If you could just sort of very briefly explain this, and I think this is really a districting issue as well. And it's related to the same sort of issues. If you could sort of just give the audience a sense of what that means and how that fits into this conversation.
Sure. So the Electoral College, as you mentioned, is actually how we elect our president in the United States, and it's evolved somewhat over the course of U.S. history. But essentially, what happens in states is that the electors follow the will of the popular vote. So if the popular vote in the state goes for one candidate, then the electors are all pledged to that candidate, and they cast their votes for that candidate. In 2016, we had sort of an extraordinary situation, which is we had more faithless electors than we'd ever had. A faithless elector is someone who's pledged to vote for a candidate based on the popular vote in their state, but they choose someone else. And in two of the states where this happened, Washington and Colorado, those states had laws on the books that actually either removed or put criminal penalties on faithless electors. And those faithless electors sued, and they said, we have direct, constitutional authority to cast votes according to conscience. And this year, conscience dictates that we vote not for the popular vote, but for someone else. That went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled over the summer that states could constitutionally bind electors. And that was a good outcome in the sense that it clarified that question, because you can imagine, if we were going into the 2020 election and electors could vote for whoever they wanted to vote for, they'd been freed by the Supreme Court if it had ruled otherwise, that might have made us nervous about, whether our votes really matter on November 3rd. But it's interesting because, it's sort of like be careful what you wish for, because, when President Trump went into the hospital the other day, a lot of people in the election law world were wondering, what happens if, let's say Donald Trump wins the popular vote, but doesn't survive, until when the electors actually cast their ballots in December. And so, don't we want sort of faithless electors at that point being to vote for someone besides the popular vote winner? And, that question actually was expressly acknowledged by the court in the faithless electors case last summer, but they said it was sort of beyond the question that they were deciding that day. So they left the question open of what happens if a candidate dies after the popular vote is in. So it's very complicated, and there's sort of a lot of discussion about what actually will happen. But I guess the bottom line is, and sort of the takeaway that I think people should draw at this point, is that our Constitution delegates to state legislatures the authority to appoint electors. And it may be that state legislatures in some states like Pennsylvania play a greater role in appointing electors than some of us may be comfortable with. So I think we're going to have to sort of wait and see what happens.
So David, is this another sort of dimension of gerrymandering? I mean, not the gerrymandering in the sense of like literally drawing district lines, but is this another way that like the individual choices get translated through this political mechanism and maybe have some pretty unusual properties or features? What do you think?
I do. I mean, I think it's really concerning. I mean, we don't necessarily, when you vote for president, as Rebecca said, you are voting for an elector. You are not voting for the candidate you think you are voting for. And, the law around this and the constitutional guidelines have in some ways, they've just never been tested. And I'm not sure we want them to be tested. And yet here we are on a collision course, potentially, with the kind of crisis that could really create challenges. I think the nightmare scenario a lot of us imagine is that a crush of mail-in ballots slows down the counting in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Again, we're talking about these gerrymandered states once again, states that could, if they wanted, begin the count of their ballots ahead of time and get ready for this. Michigan just this week gave their election officials a 10-hour head start on the 2.1 million ballots that they're going to have to count by mail, which is not going to be enough. So we could have slower results than usual. You have a president with an itchy Twitter finger who is going to go on there and potentially, claim victory early before all of the mail-in votes that could lean Democratic come in these states. You've got lawyers who are going to be rushing into courthouses around the country. You've got this sort of 5-week period in between Election Day and Safe Harbor Day for the Electoral College, in which states have to begin this process of certification. And what happens if these counts aren't completed? What happens if they are wrapped up in litigation? The same way Florida was in the recount back in 2000 in Bush versus Gore. Will these state legislatures begin the process of trying to appoint their own electors again? Again, we're talking about gerrymandered states in which if the popular vote follows the polls, as the polls look now, the polls would be looking blue, but these legislatures have been gerrymandered red. What happens then? Do Democratic governors of states with Republican legislatures have the ability to veto any move like that? I saw a great interview with a great election law professor, Ned Foley at Ohio State the other day, and he kind of threw his hands up in the air and he said, I've been doing this for 30 years and I have no idea what the answer to that question is. We may all find out. And I don't think anybody exactly necessarily knows what the answer is to some of these constitutional questions we could conceivably face over the course of the next 2 months.
All right, so that's all these answers or comments have been really helpful. So let me, now that David sort of read a whole sequence of nightmare scenarios, for those interested in sort of understanding what there is to know, Johanna, you could put up Rick Hazen's book. This is an opportunity for something that you might want to read. Joanna, yes, thank you. I didn't write this book, so I'm not plugging my own book here, but it's an interesting book about, I wouldn't say some of these scenarios, insofar as, the world, things are evolving really quickly, but for those of you who are interested in understanding some of the disputes and potentials for problems, that's a really good book to read. So David mentioned Ned Foley at Ohio State. His work is also good. It's more academic, so I would suggest reading Rick Hazen's book on meltdown. Of course, make your day good, as David's speech just did. Okay, so I would like to sort of transition into sort of now thinking more about voters directly. Of course, we've been talking about sort of indirectly as well, and thinking about voter protection, and really what capturing the flag was. And I want to start just before we talk about voters, just a quick question for Anne. As I was watching the movie, and I'm sure you think about this all the time, you know, filming sort of ongoing contentious political events is tricky. It's, you know, you saw that in Slay the Dragon, but I think you really saw it in Capturing the Flag because because there were voters, I mean, who were there, you were sort of on film for one, short amount of time. What do you think about how these voters react to you? I mean, are you, as a filmmaker, when you're filming people in these acts, do you worry that they're performing for you, that they might be more compliant or less compliant, or more trusting or not less trusting, thinking about Laverne's comments? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I actually think that the saving grace in all of this as a filmmaker is that voting is actually incredibly emotional for people, and it's very personal to people. And they don't have to pretend, in a sense, I guess, is that we're already there. And we're already in this dramatic moment with them. And getting there, Laverne and I had a lot of conversations about the camera and how we didn't, we were very careful that we didn't want the camera to interfere with the work that she and the other voter protectors were doing, but also that we didn't ever want to have the camera's presence discourage anyone from fighting for their right to vote. I mean, that was the whole point. I think that what I learned as a filmmaker is it's a dance, and you bring the cameras in slowly. Sometimes you send one of your we had an associate producer with us. Sometimes you send someone to talk to the voter first. You navigate it, and you make the voter feel safe. I think the big thing with documentary in general is you have to understand that all we really have as human beings is our own story. And so when you are trying to tell someone's story, that's a huge deal. And I think around an issue like voting, it becomes even bigger, because not only is it their story, but it's their voice, and it's their sense of power and their sense of identity in the society. So I think that I didn't really worry that people were performing for me. A couple of times you were worried that you were going to scare someone away or discourage someone, and in that case, the cameras would demur. I don't know. Is that a correct approximation of how we work together as a team? We were very communicative with Laverne and Steve and Claire in the moments to read what was going on.
Yeah, that's it's
Right.
interesting. I mean, all this work in social science about whether you observe, is the act of observing actually change the behaviors? It's a tricky question.
People are really used to cameras now. Also, I think it's very different now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. People are way more used to cameras being around and things being filmed.
Okay. Yeah, if my generation, I sort of think, is that good or bad? I guess that's a separate debate. I was one thing I liked about Capturing the Flag was that I thought it was, realistic in the sense that it showed like some aspects of anything is voter protection is sort of mundane, because life is, of course, like that. And I was wondering about, there's this saying, I'm sure I'm not going to say it particularly, eloquently, but it's sort of eloquently, for soldiers, life is 99% boredom and 1% terror. And I wonder if sort of that's your sense, thinking about, again, sort of Othniel, now like, are most questions that you get, are they sort of boilerplate and occasionally there's a really complicated one? Or is it, all of them are really complicated? And I guess I'd like your sense on that. And then Laverne, I'm curious about your experiences, on camera and the film, of course. What Anne showed was like some of the interaction, but of course there were many more that we didn't see. And I'm just sort of, again, sort of like the question of Othniel, what is it like pretty much boilerplate, or are they all sort of complicated? Anyway, Othniel, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So I would say it's been so far a mixed bag. With this election, I think everybody is on high alert. Everybody wants to get out their vote. Everybody wants their vote to be casted this election cycle. So the questions that we get most of the time are dealing with, where is my polling place? I want to make sure I go to the right place. Or how do I register to vote? How do I get my absentee ballot? Where do I request my absentee ballot? You know, or even people call in and they, have questions about the witness requirement for the absentee ballot. And some people may think those questions are mundane, but I think those questions are really important in the long haul, especially when it comes down to absentee voting, because COVID-19 has changed everything, and people aren't used to voting by mail mostly. And, we have projections that, possibly close to 40% of our voters in North Carolina are going to take advantage of voting by mail absentee this year. So a lot of questions are coming in about absentee balloting, the witness requirements, signatures, all of that. And to some people that may be mundane, but I think, if we can provide people with the correct information, I think in the long haul, it goes a long way. And I think that, will make the difference in the election results.
Laverne, what is your sense about similar for you? I mean, what was not shown? And I guess, Anne and you can talk about this. I imagine you did when you sort of decide here's a valuable interaction, here's one less so.
Well, first I can say that when we were working as volunteers, the night before the election, we said, we hope that this is really boring and we have nothing to do. Then things would be going great. And so there are some scenes in the film where you see us just sitting there and it looks kind of boring. That to us is great because things are going fine. But what happens is that it is a mix of general questions that come up over and over again. And then there's always the bizarre. Anne was very, very creative because she managed to make a film with one camera crew with 4 people that were in different places. So the crew went around and around. And of course it missed things. Because things would happen when the film crew wasn't there. And so the things that would be exciting because, we would get to do something now, this is important, are the things that are really heartbreaking because it's someone with a desire to vote that's hitting up against something that is that's really unfortunate. One of the things that you didn't see because the camera just wasn't there, is that at an early voting site, a woman came out and she just looked upset. I mean, she wasn't saying anything, she wasn't asking any questions, but I went over to talk to her because she was upset. And I said, I do have trouble voting. And she stopped and she said, well, I had to vote by a provisional ballot, but the person inside said, don't even bother voting by provisional ballot because we're just going to boot the ballots. Well, that made me crazy. And so, of course, I had to say to her, that's not going to happen. You go back in there, you demand a ballot, you come back out here and sign an affidavit, and we're going to follow this to make sure that your provisional ballot gets looked at, and if it can get counted. That's a great thing for me because I felt like, woohoo, I'm the little hero. But I would have much preferred if people were just letting this woman vote. And there are lots of anecdotes like that, but a boring day is a good day.
Yeah. Okay. Before we go to our first question, I just want to say, Anne, your sense too. I mean, you're hoping for nothing, so to speak.
Yeah, you were. I mean, what's interesting about the process of making this film is that we didn't intend to make a feature film. We really thought we were making a little short about, a kind of feel-good piece about how do you participate in democracy, sort of modeling good citizenship and how we do that. And what, of course, the election went the way it went. We saw a lot of what we saw, and the world turned into what the world turned into, and we developed this piece out of that material. But what I will say is that, one of the things that really surprised me was that a lot of people, when they have a problem at the poll, really assume that it's their own fault, that they did something wrong. And there is so much, as Othniel was saying, there's so much misinformation. Like, people just want to know, where do I go? What do I do? And in sort of highlighting these really small moments, what I was hoping for, and what I think the film hopefully does, is it highlights that every single vote is really important. And it really does have value. And if you help one person get through this sort of muddy moment, you're part of that larger engine that keeps the democracy rolling. We tend to think about, millions of votes and tens of thousands of votes, but you have to get there one vote at a time. And so I think in that way, yeah, you do want the thing that's going to end up on the evening news somehow, but you also don't want the thing that's going to end up in the evening news, because you want people to understand that the system can work if we can help make it work better.
Great. These are really enlightening things. Okay, we would like to have our first question. All right, this is from Matthew Fay. How does campaign finance reform play into issues around voter suppression? Boy, that's a really important question. I'm looking at my panelists. David, do you want to take a crack at that? Rebecca?
Yeah, well, I think that there's sort of two very different areas. So it's sort of not immediately clear that there's a lot of overlap. But I think when it comes to campaign finance reform, one of the big questions, of course, that's swirling is about dark money and the ability of independent expenditure groups to spend unlimited amounts of money without identifying themselves. And I think what that kind of environment, that kind of backdrop produces is well, it affects, which candidates run, who voters can vote for. It sort of it produces sort of a distorting effect in our electoral system. But I wouldn't say that relates. I wouldn't really call that a type of voter suppression, which is more traditionally means that are used to prevent people from accessing the ballot box. So it's not quite the same thing. But I do think it feeds the kind of information environment that voters operate in. And sometimes, misinformation and disinformation that's a product of unaccountable speech can actually act as, a suppressant in terms of people thinking their votes don't matter, or being misinformed about the issues and not voting in their own benefit. So it's a very complicated overlay between voter suppression and campaign finance reform. But I think it's all part of the same sort of problem, which is this sort of unfortunate distortion of our electoral system.
David, any thoughts? Do you see, thinking about your movie and all these operations that were discussed in efforts to have citizen referenda and so forth, they're very costly. So I imagine that perhaps one thing that Matthew is asking about is, is money that candidates are raising, are they using it in ways to make voting easier, to make it more difficult? I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at, but that seems to be a natural question that sort of fits into the theme of Slay the Dragon.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Supreme Court decides the Citizens United case in January of 2010. And that essentially loosens the guardrails for the torrent of unregulated dark money that comes flooding into our system immediately thereafter. And the Republican Party had already decided to run Red Map. So they had already begun raising the $30 million that they would spend on the state legislative play, with the goal of trying to control districting the following year. But what I certainly learned as I tried to follow that money in the book is that it made it extraordinarily difficult to sort of track where the money was coming from and where it went. a lot of that money, as my North Carolina friends know, ended up down there, in being filtered through Art Pope and some of his groups, and found their way into negative campaign ads that attacked incumbents in North Carolina's House and Senate, and led to the Republican takeover of the House there. So certainly the Republican strategy on redistricting in 2010 was set when Citizens United came down, but it made it easier, and it made the folks who funded it far less accountable. But absolutely, everything you say about initiatives is also deeply relevant. The kind of dark money that goes into our political campaigns also winds up in these amendment races, and oftentimes it's the same dark money forces tied to the Koch brothers, are sort of tied to these, various freedom foundation and organizations in various states that end up with millions of dollars to sort of fund legal battles, the likes of which you saw in Michigan in the film and in other states.
Okay, great. Thank you. Two things. We're going to go till another 15 minutes here, and I want to address the next question. Joanna, if you could. Okay, great. Fair enough. Awful to have to ask this from Sandra Steele. What sense do panelists have of potential intimidation from threats by militia-type people? So let me turn, Othniel, to you first. Because I mean, I think you probably have the closest, you're the closest to like hearing about this from voters when they call. So one question that I'd ask of you is like, are people calling like concerned about this? And then I'd like to ask, and like my follow-up would be, like, I think, to Laverne and potentially to Anne too. Is like, did you see any of this in 2000 in the previous election, 2016? And as you think about the upcoming election, Laverne, you're going back to North Carolina, I believe.
I hope so, yes.
Hope so, yes. How are you preparing, for the potential of this? And like, do you think this is a real issue? I mean, this is one of these things that I think is floating around. Anyway, so Othniel, could we start with you?
Sure. So we haven't been receiving calls about these types of militia types so far. And I don't want to put fear into the hearts of voters or to the audience, but there is a organized, leveled campaign to suppress the vote, to not only to misinform voters, but to also try to intimidate election officials, to try to stand outside and, wave flags. Like there was an example most recently in Virginia where the supporters of the president were blocking the entrance of an early voting site. Those are types of things that are going to be seen throughout the nation. And we also know that, we're going to have our own observers at the polls, but also, the Republicans are going to have observers at the polls. And we know that, there's going to be some challenges by Republican observers, but people like Laverne who come and people who are going to be on the ground, they're going to be there ready to fight the good fight with us. And I think just because, there are militia types being spread around, that's the word that's going around, I don't think people should fear that. And I think people should know that we have a volunteer army of our own.
I just want to add to that there was a lot of concern about that in 2016 also. And we did see a couple of sort of looming characters and at the polls. But what we found was a lot what Othniel's saying is that there were so many volunteers on the other side from Democracy NC, from the NAACP, from various organizations that were there, that it is all of us coming together to vote. So it's sort of like the more of us that show up in support of that, I think we have a better chance of minimizing what that is. And the people that we saw, I mean, there was one person at an early voting site that was sort of lurking around, and there was someone at the Cliffdale Recreation Center at the end of the night where Laverne was in the film. But they didn't have a huge impact on the overall, on the overall environment there. Not to say that there won't be things, but I'm also all about, like, we don't want people to be afraid. We need to understand that is still and should always remain a fringe mentality. And in a way, we need to treat it like that. And the grown-ups need to show up in the room and be grown-ups,
Rebecca, please.
Yeah, can I just add, our system relies on poll observation, that both parties are present and watching and, keeping an eye and holding officials accountable. And, it's not a partisan thing. It's actually a bipartisan thing. And elections work, baked into our system is the idea that candidate representatives, party representatives from both sides, from all sides, will watch the system work. And so there are some challenges this year related to that. One of the big ones is, people might, people who do that kind of work are typically from the older generation. And there's some concern that kind of observer, core won't be available this year because of people will be concerned about COVID. So I think there's a lot of work to do to energize young people to fill election observer roles. I think that's going to be really important. And then I think it's also important to mention that voter intimidation is a federal crime. All states have laws on the books that prohibit, anyone interfering with a person's right to vote. So there are, effective laws in place, and I think there will be a lot of people watching. So, we do have that going for voters.
So Laverne, I know I asked you a follow-up, but I want to withdraw because I want to ask a different one, given that I've just heard. I mean, sorry. Do you think? I mean, listening to what we just heard about this question. I mean, when you and your other lawyers and your colleagues are thinking about going, do these fears make people more likely to go or less likely to go?
I don't think it's either, actually. I mean, before 2016, a group of us were all sitting around at a dinner trying to figure out where we were going to go and how. And we talked about whether or not we were going to take mace with us because we, wanted to be protected. And then we looked at each other and said, we'll probably end up macing ourselves and left it at home. So, so I think that, yes, you have fear. And the scariest part of the whole movie is when I see myself walking out into the dark by myself. So you have the fear, but you also have the commitment. And I have to follow up on something that David said. Yes, there may be fringe people that want to do things, but basically people that are there doing that work want the system to work, no matter which party they represent. And so I can't tell you how many day-long friendships I made across party lines because everyone was there to be able to try and do the work of allowing people to be able to exercise their right to vote.
Great. Okay, thank you.
I'm confident that's going to happen again.
Got it. Okay. All right. We have another question here. I'm waiting for it to pop up from Reeve Green. If you had to pick the worst voting suppression state you're most worried about impacting the 2020 outcome, which would it be? I'm trying to think here. I do this. I'm looking around at all of you. Who would like to offer the worst example?
I'm worried about, I'll jump in.
Rebecca,
I'm worried about Florida, especially with the felony disenfranchisement shenanigans that have been happening down there. There's, as David mentioned, 1.4 million people got their right to vote back, and then they got their right to vote taken away. And there's an effort there to the reason they got it taken away was that the legislature decided that only people who had paid their fines and fees were eligible under the constitutional amendment to regain the right to vote. And so there's a huge effort to pay those fines and fees, to raise money to pay those fines and fees. But I do think, that is one sort of large, sort of consequential voter suppression, mechanism that's playing out. And I think that's going to have a huge impact on the election in Florida. I hope it doesn't, but I think it's going to. So that's certainly one to look out for.
Okay, so one vote for Florida.
I'll throw my hand up for Texas. Texas is a lot of electoral college votes. There's some really not such great stuff going on in Texas right now, both with absentee ballot drops, a lot of the laws that are in place, a lot of the districting is terrible. Like, there's just a lot of things in Texas. They closed more polling sites in Texas than any other state after Shelby v. Holder. And a lot of the more rural areas, there's real serious barriers to voting. So I'll throw my hand up for Texas.
Okay, I think, David, you were also voting for Texas, is that right?
I'll play ranked choice voting, and since Texas has already come up, I will throw in a second choice for the state of Wisconsin.
And could you a quick overview of Wisconsin, maybe in 30 seconds?
The state of Wisconsin in 2018 elected a Democratic U.S. senator. They elected a Democratic governor. They elected Democrats every statewide office. They gave Democratic candidates for assembly 205,000 more votes than Republican candidates, and Democrats gained one seat. And they moved the edge to 63-36. It is a deeply gerrymandered state with a legislature that has played ruthless, power-hungry games. They have enacted a voter ID law that's one of the most stringent in the country. Lots of people think it prohibited as many as 300,000 people from reaching the polls in 2016 in a state that was decided by about 22,000 votes. When you factor in what they're willing to do in April, and as far as forcing voters to the polls in the middle of a pandemic, I think that there is very little that the ruthless folks in charge in that state will not do to hold on to power.
All right. So we have 3 states with 1 vote. Laverne?
I think I have to go with my gal Anne and go to Texas, but I'll also do ranked choice voting and have Wisconsin for 2.
Okay. We'll have another panel on different forms of voting here. Othniel, I think you want to be a tiebreaker, or possibly?
No, I have to say North Carolina. Just because of the way the election has changed due to absentee ballots. North Carolina has one of the highest absentee ballot rejection rates in the country. And possibly 40% of eligible voters in North Carolina are voting absentee. That's a lot of votes. And if the rejection rate stays at possibly 10%, that's going to be a huge problem for the election, just because North Carolina is truly a toss-up between the president and Vice President Biden.
Got it. All right. Well, so Reeve, I don't think we have well, I guess Texas is the clear winner, if you want to call it winning. But all right, good. These are all interesting answers. What this I think all those answers show you is like how varied and widespread some of these issues are. In some ways, I sort of wish that everyone knew they could say, oh yes, of course it's there. But the fact that people disagree is that's sort of a remarkable thing too. It means that these issues sort of cut across a lot of different states. Anyway, okay, and very interesting question. All right, we've all right. Do we have any other questions? I'm just looking at my screen here. So we've talked a lot. I mean, when you have a conversation about elections and it's a now. There are a lot of issues that come up that are sort of negative. I mean, these movies were optimistic, but also couched in a difficult period, difficult time, and I think we're in that world still, at different reasons perhaps, but similar sorts of issues. So one question is, like, if you were to give advice to someone, whether voting advice or volunteering advice, what would it be? I just, if anyone could sort of, take a crack at this one, how would you advise people to either, again, make their own vote count, or help other people? I don't want to say what order we should go in, but I'm happy to call people if you're all polite.
I'll just start up and say that I think the best thing that we can do is believe in the system and hold the system accountable. So it's a combination of like being positive, believing that what you're doing and that your vote matters, but also presenting that to your community of people and however large that community is. But this only works if we all participate and if we all believe that the participation can matter. And sometimes we have to insist that the participation matters. And that's what you see with the work that Othniel does, the work that Laverne does on the ground with voters, is trying to help people understand that their vote really does matter. So get out and vote, help someone else vote, protect the right to vote, Great.
All right. Okay, good. Who's next?
I would say that, people should apply to be a poll worker. I mean, there are so many states that have had poll worker shortages. Most recently, I heard about, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania had poll worker shortages. So I think if you can take a day off of work, or if you can just volunteer time to be a poll worker, that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, and just to be clear, if there aren't enough poll workers, that means that polling places will not be open. And on April 7th in Wisconsin, Milwaukee went from 180 polling places to just 5. And the reason was that they didn't have enough poll workers, which is hard to wrestle up in a pandemic. So I echo that point that, to the extent that you can either volunteer yourself or recruit young people to be poll workers, that would be a really important way to contribute. And I think another way to contribute is just find out what the accurate information is for how to vote. What is required for an absentee ballot to count. I'm worried about people submitting incomplete absentee ballots. They're not signing it. They're not putting the date on there, or whatever the requirement is. That could mean that vote doesn't count. So to the extent that people are able to ensure that they understand how to vote absentee and that they're able to spread accurate information, I think is really important.
Great. David or Laverne?
I would say I would emphasize that make a plan for how you're going to vote, and then make a plan to help somebody else make a plan. Because the only thing that is better than your own plan is your really helping 1, 2, 3, 5 other people make their plan. And I think that's the most important thing, because sometimes people need some encouragement, or they may need some help, or they may need being driven to the polls. So make your plan and then help them make their plan.
Great. Okay, David.
Make your plan, but then remember this is a redistricting year. This is a census year, once again. The White House is on the ballot. The U.S. Senate is on the ballot. Those are the races getting all of the sexy attention. It's the state legislators on the back of your ballot who are going to be drawing the districts that you live in your state for the next 10 years. So don't just vote at the top of the ballot. Vote all the way down. Understand that your democracy is on the ballot, that these district lines, they are the building blocks of it. And when they get twisted by legislators for their own partisan ends, it severs the connection between you and a representative democracy. You can take it back this year, up and down the ballot.
Great. Those are all good answers. I'm going to throw in my own answer for a second, too, following up on what Rebecca said. I think Sandra mentioned in the beginning of this program, Samantha, excuse me. My work right now and academic work is on absentee voting. And one thing that my colleagues and I are interested in is like how experienced absentee voters are different than inexperienced absentee voters. That's a really important issue this year because so many people are voting absentee. Therefore, they're new to absentee voting. And what we have been able to find with our data from Florida is that the rates of like late ballots and mistakes that cause rejections are 2 to 3 times higher for people who are inexperienced. So when you think about this sort of planning advice, and we've heard different dimensions, it's really worth keeping in mind that what the research is showing is that people who are new to absentee voting just make more mistakes. And it shouldn't really surprise us. People new to anything make more mistakes. But you can really see it here. And in some states, if you submit your ballot with missing a signature, you have no choice. You have no chance to fix it. Some states you do. It varies by state. But I would encourage people, when you think about making sure your vote counts, that should, really paying attention to those directions is particularly important. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great getting to meet all these panelists. I sort of wish that we were in person. I'm sure a lot of us, obviously that's just the world right now. On the other hand, it does make it easier to have these meetings of people scattered around the country. So we'll look on the bright side of that one too. I just wanted to thank the 5 of you, as well as all the audience, and the questions that were submitted, and WRIF. So thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoys the next month, the run up to the election, and I hope you all learned from this great conversation. Okay, thank you.